Marcus Chin moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of someone who had built his fortune by recognizing opportunities that others missed, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. And I felt my heart begin to race as 20 years of carefully maintained secrecy was about to collide with the family intervention that had been building all evening. He was accompanied by a woman I recognized as Jennifer Walsh, the Forbes journalist who had been tracking the rise of female entrepreneurs in traditionally male-dominated financial sectors. Her notebook discreetly tucked into her designer clutch as she navigated the charity gala with the practiced ease of someone who belonged in rooms where million-dollar decisions were made over champagne and canapés. My siblings were still unaware of who was approaching, still caught up in their mission to save me from what they perceived as my latest doomed venture. Their voices continuing the familiar refrain of concern and condescension that had soundtracked every family gathering for the past 2 decades. But I could see the moment recognition dawned on David's face. The way his expression shifted from brotherly concern to professional deference as he identified one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs walking directly toward our little circle of family drama. The truth was, I had been expecting this moment for months, ever since Marcus had mentioned during one of our quarterly portfolio reviews that he would be attending the Children's Hospital Gala as the keynote speaker. Since Jennifer had been pestering me through intermediaries about participating in her feature story on women who had built financial empires without traditional publicity or recognition. I had been hoping to avoid both of them tonight, to maintain the careful separation between my public anonymity and my private success, but the universe had different plans for how this evening would unfold. Sarah noticed the change in David's demeanor and followed his gaze, her attorney's instincts immediately assessing the approaching figures and calculating their significance in the social hierarchy of the charity gala, while Michael remained focused on me, still believing that our family conversation was the most important thing happening in this moment. The irony was not lost on me that my siblings were about to meet the people who knew me as Elena Martinez, the investment strategist who had quietly revolutionized portfolio management for high-net-worth clients, while they still saw me as Elena the dreamer, Elena the failure, Elena who needed their guidance to navigate a world they thought I could never understand. The journey that had brought me to this moment had begun 23 years earlier. On a Tuesday morning in October, when I walked out of my marriage to a man who had spent our entire relationship trying to convince me that my dreams were too big for someone with my background and education. I had been working as a junior analyst at a small investment firm, making barely enough money to cover my half of our modest apartment rent, when I stumbled upon a pattern in emerging market currencies that everyone else in the office had dismissed as statistical noise. I spent my lunch breaks in the public library, researching economic indicators and political developments in countries most Americans could not find on a map, building spreadsheets that traced the connections between seemingly unrelated events and their impact on currency fluctuations. My colleagues thought I was wasting my time on theoretical exercises that had no practical application, but I could see something they could not. Patterns within patterns that suggested opportunities for patient investors who were willing to think beyond the conventional wisdom of Wall Street analysts. The first investment I made with my own money was terrifying, $1,000 that represented my entire savings account, placed on a currency trade that my husband had explicitly told me not to make because it was too risky for someone who could not afford to lose. I spent 3 sleepless nights watching exchange rates fluctuate on my laptop screen, wondering if I had just proven that everyone who had ever doubted my judgment was right, until the morning when I woke up to discover that my $1,000 had become $3,000 overnight. But instead of celebrating, I reinvested the profits and began reaching out to other people who might be interested in the opportunities one was seeing. Starting with my divorce attorney, who had mentioned during our meetings that she was looking for alternative investments for her retirement portfolio. She became my first client, entrusting me with $50,000 that she had been keeping in low-yield savings accounts because she did not trust traditional financial advisors who seemed more interested in generating commissions than generating returns. Within 6 months, her portfolio had grown by 40%, and she began referring her colleagues to the quiet young woman who seemed to have an unusual talent for seeing opportunities in places where others saw only risk. I never advertised my services, never created a website or business cards or any of the traditional marketing materials that financial advisors use to attract clients, because my approach was built on relationships and results rather than promises and presentations. My siblings had no idea that while they were building their careers in medicine and law, I was spending my evenings on international conference calls with clients who lived in time zones where the markets were already open, analyzing economic data that most people would find impossibly boring, developing strategies that allowed ordinary people to participate in opportunities that had traditionally been reserved for institutional investors with billion-dollar portfolios. David had been completing his residency in cardiac surgery when I bought my first office space. A small suite in a downtown building that looked modest from the outside, but provided access to the telecommunications infrastructure I needed to monitor global markets 24 hours a day. He had no knowledge of the lease agreement I signed or the sophisticated computer systems I installed, because in his mind I was still struggling to find my direction in life, while he was saving lives in operating rooms and building a reputation that would eventually make him one of the most sought-after heart surgeons in the region. Sarah had been working her way up through the ranks at her law firm when I established my first offshore investment vehicle, a legal structure that allowed my clients to participate in international markets while maintaining the tax advantages and regulatory protections they needed to preserve their wealth for future generations. She had no awareness of the complex legal documents I was navigating or the international regulations I was mastering, because her expertise was focused on corporate litigation while mine was expanding into territories she had never explored. Michael had been in Cal school when I made my first $1 million trade, a complex currency arbitrage that took advantage of temporary inefficiencies between European and Asian markets during a period of political uncertainty that most investors were treating as a reason to avoid risk rather than an opportunity to profit from volatility. He had no knowledge of the sophisticated financial instruments I was using or the global network of contacts I was developing, because his attention was focused on learning how to treat childhood diseases, while mine was focused on understanding how geopolitical events created investment opportunities that could fund medical research for decades. The irony was that my success had actually been making their success possible in ways they never realized, because the anonymous donations I had been making to their hospitals and institutions had been providing resources that enhanced their ability to serve their patients and advance their careers. The scholarship fund I established at David's medical school had been supporting students who could not otherwise afford the education they needed to become cardiac surgeons, while the research grants I provided to Michael's hospital had been funding studies that led to breakthrough treatments for pediatric cancer patients. But I had learned to keep my philanthropy as anonymous as my business success, because explaining where the money came from would have required explanations about how I had earned it. And those explanations would have challenged their fundamental assumptions about success, failure, and the nature of achievement in ways they were not prepared to handle. It was easier to let them believe they had earned everything through their own efforts, while I quietly provided support that made their achievements possible. Marcus Chin had become my client during my 5th year in business, when he was still building the technology company that would eventually make him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. And he had entrusted me with managing the personal portfolio that would allow him to take risks with his business ventures without risking his family's financial security. Our relationship had evolved over the years from client and advisor to mutual respect and friendship, built on a shared understanding of what it meant to build something significant while maintaining privacy and discretion. Jennifer Walsh had first contacted me 3 years ago, when she was researching a story about women who had achieved financial success without traditional publicity or recognition. And she had been persistent in her efforts to convince me to participate in interviews that would showcase my approach to investment management and client relations. I had consistently declined her requests, preferring to maintain the anonymity that allowed me to operate effectively in a world where reputation was often more important than results. But both of them had been instrumental in my evolution from a small-scale investment advisor to someone who managed portfolios for clients, whose names appeared on Forbes lists and whose financial decisions had implications for entire industries and national economies. They understood the complexity of building wealth while maintaining privacy, the challenges of operating in international markets while complying with domestic regulations, and the delicate balance between growth and security that characterized successful long-term investment strategies. My siblings had no awareness of the quarterly meetings I attended in cities across 3 continents, the conferences where I presented research that influenced how pension funds and university endowments allocated billions of dollars, or the advisory boards where I provided guidance that shaped financial policy for emerging economies. They saw only the modest apartment I maintained as my official address, the simple car I drove to family gatherings, and the quiet lifestyle that I had carefully constructed to protect both my privacy and their perception of my place in the world. The truth was that I had been living a double life for so long that I had almost convinced myself it was sustainable indefinitely, that I could continue managing millions of dollars in assets, while my family believed I was struggling to find my direction in life, that I could maintain relationships with some of the most successful people in the world while my siblings thought I needed their guidance to navigate basic financial decisions. But as Marcus and Jennifer approached our little circle of family intervention, I realized that the collision I had been avoiding for 20 years was finally about to happen. And there was nothing I could do to prevent the revelations that would challenge everything my siblings thought they knew about success, achievement, and the sister they had been trying to save from herself for the better part of 4 decades. David was the first to recognize Marcus, his expression shifting from brotherly concern to professional deference as he identified one of the city's most successful entrepreneurs. And I could see him calculating how to position himself and his family to make the best impression on someone whose opinion could have significant implications for their social and professional standing. Sarah followed his lead, her attorney's training making her automatically assess the networking opportunities represented by proximity to someone of Marcus's stature and influence. Michael remained focused on me, still believing that our family conversation was more important than whatever social interactions might be developing around us, his medical training making him prioritize the immediate needs of his patient over the broader social dynamics of the charity gala. But I could see the moment when he began to realize that something significant was happening, when the energy of our conversation began to shift from internal family drama to external social opportunity. The approaching footsteps seemed to echo in the marble foyer with increasing intensity, each click of expensive shoes marking another second in the countdown to the moment when my carefully constructed anonymity would collide with my family's long-held assumptions about my capabilities and achievements. I found myself remembering all the conversations we had shared over the years, all the times they had offered advice about financial planning and career development while having no idea that I was already living the success they thought I should be aspiring to achieve. Jennifer was taking notes as she walked, her journalist's instincts making her aware that she was about to witness something significant, though she had no way of knowing that the family drama she was observing was about to intersect with the story she had been trying to tell about women who had built empires in silence. Her research had led her to understand that some of the most successful people in the world were those who operated below the radar of traditional media attention, who built wealth and influence through relationships and results rather than publicity and recognition. Marcus had mentioned during our last quarterly meeting that he was looking forward to finally meeting my family, that he was curious about the people who had shaped the woman whose investment strategies had helped him preserve and grow his wealth through multiple economic cycles and industry disruptions. I had always deflected his questions about my personal life, maintaining the professional boundaries that allowed me to serve my clients effectively while protecting my privacy and theirs. But now those boundaries were about to be dissolved by circumstances beyond my control, and I found myself wondering how my siblings would react when they discovered that the sister they had been lecturing about realistic expectations and traditional career paths had been managing investment portfolios for clients whose success they had always admired from a distance. The conversation around us was beginning to shift as other guests noticed the approaching figures and began to position themselves for potential introductions to Marcus Chin, whose presence at any social gathering was considered a significant networking opportunity by people who understood the value of building relationships with successful entrepreneurs and innovative thinkers. But none of them realized that the quiet woman being lectured by her siblings was the person who had been managing his personal investments for the better part of 2 decades. Sarah was beginning to recognize Jennifer from her appearances on financial news programs, her attorney's memory making her automatically catalog the significance of having a Forbes journalist approaching their family conversation, while David was calculating how to transition from concerned brother to impressive professional in the time it would take for the introductions to begin. But Michael remained focused on me, his medical training making him prioritize what he perceived as my immediate emotional needs over the broader social opportunities developing around us. His voice taking on the gentle firmness he used with patients who needed to accept difficult truths about their health and their future. "Elena," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated concern. "We are saying this because we love you and because someone needs to help you understand that chasing these impossible dreams is only going to lead to more disappointment and more instability." The word impossible echoed in my mind as I watched Marcus Chin approach the final few steps that would bring him within conversational distance of my family. As I prepared myself for the moment when 20 years of carefully maintained fiction would collide with a reality that none of us were prepared to handle, when the empire I had built in silence would finally meet the family who had never known it existed. "Elena," Marcus Chen's voice cut through Michael's lecture with the warm authority of someone who had built billion-dollar companies by recognizing exceptional talent when he encountered it. And I watched my brother's words die in his throat as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country approached our family circle with the kind of focused attention that commanded respect from everyone within hearing distance. "I need to steal you away for a moment," Marcus continued, his smile genuine as he extended his hand toward me with the familiarity of someone who had worked closely with me for nearly 2 decades. "There are some people here tonight who have been asking about the architect behind the portfolio strategies that have been revolutionizing institutional investment approaches across 3 continents. The silence that followed his words was so complete that I could hear the crystal chandeliers tinkling softly above us, could feel the weight of my siblings' confusion settling over our little circle like fog rolling in from the ocean on a summer evening. David's face had gone completely blank, his surgeon's training failing him in a situation where his diagnostic skills were useless against a reality that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his sister's capabilities and achievements. Sarah's legal mind was racing, trying to process information that challenged her fundamental assumptions about family hierarchy and professional success, while Michael stood frozen with his mouth slightly open. His gentle lecture about impossible dreams interrupted by evidence that suggested his understanding of possibility needed significant revision. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward with her journalist's instincts fully engaged, her notebook appearing in her hand as if by magic as she recognized the moment when a story she had been pursuing for months was about to unfold in front of witnesses who could provide the human interest angle that would make her feature article unforgettable. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the professional excitement of someone who understood the significance of what was happening, "I take it this is Elena Martinez, the investment strategist whose anonymous approach to wealth management has been generating whispers in financial circles from New York to Hong Kong." Anonymous. The word hung in the air like an accusation, carrying with it the weight of 20 years of carefully maintained secrecy that was about to be dismantled in front of the family members who had never understood why I preferred privacy to publicity. Discretion to recognition, results to reputation. I could feel other guests beginning to gather around us, drawn by the magnetic presence of Marcus Chin and the journalist whose articles had launched careers and toppled industries with equal efficiency. My siblings were still processing the implications of what they had just heard, their minds struggling to reconcile the woman they had been lecturing about realistic expectations with someone whose professional reputation apparently extended across 3 continents. But Marcus was not finished revealing the extent of our professional relationship, his voice taking on the tone of genuine admiration that he reserved for the few people whose expertise had contributed significantly to his own success. "Elena has been managing my personal investment portfolio for 18 years, he said, his words carrying the authority of someone whose financial decisions were tracked by analysts around the world. And her strategies have not only preserved my wealth through multiple market crashes and economic disruptions, but have actually generated returns that allowed me to take the entrepreneurial risks that built my current company. Without her guidance, I would never have had the financial security to pursue the innovations that have defined my career. 18 years. The number seemed to echo in the marble foyer with increasing volume, carrying with it the implication that while my siblings had been building their medical and legal careers, I had been entrusted with managing the personal finances of someone whose success they had always admired from a distance. I could see David calculating the timeline, realizing that my professional relationship with Marcus Chin had begun during his residency, when he had assumed I was still struggling to find my direction in life. Sarah's attorney training was beginning to assert itself as she processed the legal and financial implications of what she was hearing, her mind automatically calculating the kind of expertise and credentials that would be required to manage investment portfolios for clients of Marcus Chen's caliber. But before she could formulate questions that might help her understand how her perception of reality had been so fundamentally wrong for so many years, Jennifer Walsh was continuing the revelation that would reshape everything my family thought they knew about my professional capabilities. Elena's client list reads like a who's who of successful entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and industry leaders, Jennifer said, her journalist's instincts making her aware that she was witnessing the kind of human interest story that could anchor a major feature article about hidden success and family dynamics. She has been managing portfolios for clients whose combined net worth exceeds the GDP of most small countries, and she has done it all while maintaining complete anonymity and privacy, refusing interviews and avoiding publicity that might compromise her clients' confidentiality or her own effectiveness. GDP of most small countries. The phrase would have been laughable if it had not been delivered by a Forbes journalist whose research was respected by financial professionals around the world. If it had not been confirmed by the presence of Marcus Chin, whose validation carried weight in investment circles from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. I could feel my siblings' worldview shifting beneath their feet like tectonic plates adjusting to accommodate new geological realities. Michael was the first to find his voice, his medical training making him approach this new information with the same systematic analysis he brought to complex diagnoses. His words carrying the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental assumptions about his family had just been challenged by evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how is this possible? We thought you were struggling. We thought you needed our help. We thought your business ventures were never really successful." The word struggling seemed to hang in the air between us, carrying with it the weight of 2 decades of family dinners where they had offered advice about financial planning, while having no idea that I was already managing more wealth than they could comprehend. Charity galas where they had networking while I was quietly donating more money than their combined contributions. Holiday gatherings where they had discussed their professional achievements while remaining unaware that my professional reputation extended far beyond anything they had accomplished in their traditional careers. Marcus placed his hand on my shoulder with the familiarity of someone who had worked closely with me through market volatilities and economic uncertainties that would have destroyed less skilled investors. His voice taking on the tone of someone who understood the complexity of building success while maintaining privacy. "Elena has always preferred to let her results speak for themselves rather than seeking recognition or publicity," he said, his words carrying the respect of someone whose own success had been enhanced by my professional guidance. "She operates in a world where reputation is built through discretion and effectiveness rather than marketing and self-promotion." Discretion. Effectiveness. The words described principles that had guided my career for 2 decades, values that had allowed me to build relationships with clients who trusted me with their most important financial decisions because they knew I would never compromise their privacy or my own integrity for the sake of recognition or validation. But they also described a way of living that had created a fundamental disconnect between my professional achievements and my family's perception of my capabilities. David was beginning to process the implications of what he was hearing. his surgeon's mind applying the same analytical approach he used to diagnose complex cardiac conditions to the puzzle of how his sister had managed to build a successful career while maintaining the fiction that she was still searching for her direction in life. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose diagnostic skills had failed him completely, "if this is true, if you have really been managing investments for people like Marcus, then why did you let us believe you were struggling? Why did you let us think you needed our advice and our help?" The question contained layers of confusion and hurt that I had been anticipating for years. The inevitable collision between the protective fiction I had maintained and the reality of my professional success that had always been too complex to explain in the context of family gatherings and holiday dinners. How could I tell them that I had allowed them to believe I was struggling because it was easier than explaining the international conference calls that interrupted family dinners, the weekend travel that took me to meetings with clients whose names they would recognize from financial magazines, the responsibility of managing wealth that could fund their hospitals and schools for decades? Jennifer was taking notes with the intensity of someone who understood that she was witnessing the kind of human drama that could illustrate the broader themes she had been exploring in her research about successful women who operated below the radar of traditional recognition and publicity. "This is exactly the kind of story I have been trying to tell," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of a journalist who had stumbled upon a narrative that perfectly illustrated her thesis about hidden success and alternative definitions of achievement. Sarah was struggling to reconcile 20 years of family dynamics with the new information she was processing. Her legal mind trying to construct a framework that could accommodate both her perception of family hierarchy and the evidence that suggested her understanding of professional success needed fundamental revision. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying the precise articulation she brought to complex legal arguments, "I need to understand how this is possible. How can you have been managing investments for billionaires while we thought you were barely managing your own finances? How can your professional reputation extend across 3 continents while we had no idea you had any professional reputation at all?" The questions were fair but impossible to answer in the context of a charity gala surrounded by guests who were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be discussed in professional and social circles for months to come. How could I explain that I had built my career by maintaining exactly the kind of privacy that was now being dissolved by circumstances beyond my control? That my success had been built on relationships that required discretion and confidentiality that extended to my own family? Marcus seemed to understand the complexity of the situation, his entrepreneurial experience making him aware of the challenges that came with success that operated outside traditional recognition and validation systems. Elena has always been remarkable in her ability to achieve extraordinary results while maintaining the personal boundaries that allow her to operate effectively, he said, his words carrying the respect of someone who understood that some forms of success required privacy and discretion rather than publicity and recognition. But Michael was not satisfied with explanations about privacy and discretion, his medical training making him focus on the human impact of the revelations that were reshaping his understanding of family relationships and professional achievement. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the gentle persistence he used with patients who needed to confront difficult truths about their health and their future, "we have been worrying about you for 20 years. We have been offering advice and support and help because we thought you needed it, because we thought you were struggling to find your place in the world. How could you let us continue believing something that was so completely wrong?" The hurt in his voice was genuine, carrying with it the weight of years of concern and care that had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my circumstances and capabilities. But before I could formulate an answer that might help him understand the complexity of maintaining professional success while preserving family relationships, other guests were beginning to approach our conversation, drawn by the presence of Marcus Chin and Jennifer Walsh and the growing awareness that something significant was happening in the marble foyer of the charity gala. Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of pediatric oncology at Children's Hospital and one of Michael's colleagues, approached with the kind of professional curiosity that characterized successful medical administrators, her voice carrying the authority of someone who managed budgets that funded life-saving research and treatment programs. "Excuse me," she said, her words directed toward Marcus, but her attention clearly focused on me. I could not help but overhear your conversation. And I am wondering if Elena Martinez might be the same person who has been providing anonymous funding for our pediatric cancer research program for the past 15 years. Anonymous funding. The phrase seemed to echo in the growing circle of guests who were gathering around our conversation, carrying with it implications that extended far beyond investment management and portfolio strategies into the realm of philanthropy and community impact that my siblings had always considered their exclusive domain through their medical and legal careers. Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone who understood that Elena's influence extended far beyond financial management into areas of social impact that most people never connected to successful investment strategies. "Patricia," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had witnessed Elena's generosity firsthand, "I think you will find that Elena's contributions to medical research and education have been even more extensive than you realize, though she has always insisted on maintaining the anonymity that allows her to support causes she believes in without compromising the privacy that her professional work requires." 15 years of anonymous funding. The revelation was beginning to paint a picture of my professional and philanthropic activities that extended far beyond anything my siblings had imagined possible. A network of relationships and responsibilities that had been operating parallel to their perception of my struggles and failures without ever intersecting with their understanding of my capabilities and achievements. David was beginning to connect the dots between the anonymous funding Patricia had mentioned and the conversations we had shared over the years about the challenges of funding medical research and education. Realizing that his sister had been providing solutions to problems he had only been able to discuss in theoretical terms. Sarah was processing the legal implications of maintaining anonymous charitable contributions while building a successful investment management business. Understanding that the complexity of such arrangements required expertise that contradicted everything she thought she knew about my professional capabilities. But it was Michael who seemed most affected by the revelations that were continuing to unfold around us. His medical training making him understand the life-saving impact of the research funding that had apparently been provided by the sister he had been lecturing about realistic expectations and traditional career paths just minutes earlier. "Elena," he said, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of conversations around us, "if you have been funding pediatric cancer research for 15 years, if you have been managing investments for people like Marcus, if your professional reputation extends across 3 continents, then everything we thought we knew about you, everything we thought we knew about our family, everything we thought we knew about success and achievement has been completely wrong." The admission carried with it a weight of recognition that went beyond personal embarrassment into the realm of fundamental questions about perception and reality, about the nature of achievement and the different ways that success could be defined and measured and valued by people who operated in different spheres of influence and impact. Jennifer was capturing every moment of the conversation with the skill of someone who understood that she was witnessing exactly the kind of human drama that could illustrate the broader themes about hidden success and alternative achievement that had been the focus of her research for months. But as the circle of guests continued to expand around us, I realized that the privacy I had maintained for 20 years was being dissolved not just for my family, but for everyone in attendance at the charity gala. Marcus seemed to recognize my discomfort with the growing attention. His entrepreneurial experience making him understand the challenges that came with unwanted publicity and the invasion of privacy that could compromise the effectiveness of someone whose success had been built on discretion and confidentiality. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the protective tone of someone who valued our professional relationship too much to allow it to be damaged by circumstances beyond our control. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting where you can process these revelations with your family without the complications of public attention." But before I could respond to his suggestion, Dr. Williams was continuing her own revelations about the extent of my anonymous contributions to medical research and education, her voice carrying the gratitude of someone whose life's work had been enhanced by generosity she had never been able to properly acknowledge. "Elena," she said, her words carrying the respect of someone who understood the impact of sustained philanthropic commitment, Your contributions have funded breakthrough treatments that have saved the lives of hundreds of children over the past 15 years. Our research program would not exist without your support, and the medical advances we have achieved would not have been possible without your vision and your generosity. Hundreds of children. The phrase seemed to resonate in the marble foyer with increasing intensity, carrying with it implications about impact and achievement that extended far beyond financial success into the realm of life-saving medical research that my siblings had dedicated their own careers to advancing through their professional work. Michael's face was reflecting a complex mixture of emotions as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. His medical training making him understand better than anyone else in our family the significance of sustained funding for pediatric cancer research and the lives that had been saved by treatments that had been developed with support I had provided, anonymously for 15 years. Elena, he said, his voice carrying the kind of awe that he usually reserved for medical breakthroughs and life-saving procedures, you have been saving children's lives for 15 years while we thought you were struggling to find your direction in life. You have been funding the research that has made my work possible while we worried about your financial stability and your professional future. The recognition in his voice was accompanied by a dawning understanding of how completely our family's perception of achievement and success had been challenged by revelations that none of us had been prepared to process. But as I looked at their faces, at the mixture of confusion and hurt and amazement that was replacing 20 years of condescension and concern, I realized that this moment represented an opportunity for our family relationships to be rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than the protective fiction I had maintained for so long. The crowd around us was continuing to grow as word spread through the charity gala that something significant was happening in the marble foyer, that Marcus Chin and a Forbes journalist were revealing information about one of the most successful but anonymous investment strategists in the country, that the quiet woman who had been attending these events for years was apparently responsible for funding that had supported medical research and education programs that had impacted thousands of lives. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the attention or vindicated by the recognition, I found myself experiencing a sense of peace that I had not felt in 20 years. A relief that came from knowing that the exhausting process of maintaining two separate identities was finally coming to an end. My siblings were looking at me with new eyes, seeing not the struggling sister who needed their guidance and support, but a woman who had built something extraordinary while maintaining the grace and humility that had always been more important to me than recognition or validation. David was the first to speak, his surgeon's training making him approach this new reality with the same systematic analysis he brought to complex medical procedures. His voice carrying the respect of someone who understood that his fundamental assumptions about family and achievement had been proven completely wrong. Elena, he said, his words careful and measured, I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I can express in words. We have been treating you like someone who needed our help and guidance while you were actually operating at a level of professional success that exceeds anything any of us have achieved in our own careers. The apology was genuine, carrying with it a recognition that went beyond personal embarrassment into the realm of genuine respect for achievements that had been hidden, but were now being revealed in a setting that provided validation from sources that could not be questioned or dismissed. Sarah was nodding in agreement, her legal mind processing the complexity of maintaining the professional relationships and philanthropic commitments that had apparently defined my career for 2 decades. Michael moved closer to me, his medical training making him focus on the human impact of the revelations that had transformed our family dynamics in the space of a single conversation, his voice carrying the gentle sincerity that made him beloved by his pediatric patients and their families. Elena, he said, his words barely audible above the growing murmur of conversations around us, I understand now why you maintained your privacy, why you allowed us to believe what we believed. But I need you to know that what you have accomplished, the lives you have saved, the impact you have had on medical research and education, makes you one of the most remarkable people I have ever known. The recognition in his voice was accompanied by a dawning understanding that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with public recognition or family validation. that the most significant achievements were sometimes those that operated below the radar of traditional acknowledgement and publicity. As I looked at their faces, at the mixture of amazement and respect and newfound understanding that was replacing decades of condescension and concern, I realized that this moment represented not just the end of a carefully maintained fiction, but the beginning of family relationships that could be built on truth rather than assumptions, on respect rather than hierarchy, on recognition of different forms of achievement rather than narrow definitions of success. The empire I had built in silence was no longer silent, but the dignity and grace that had guided my journey from their dismissed little sister to something they could never have imagined was still intact, still defining how I chose to respond to revelations that would reshape our family dynamics for years to come. Before I share what happened next, I want you to know that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones that come not from proving others wrong, but from finally allowing the truth to speak for itself. Sometimes the greatest strength is not in seeking recognition, but in building something so meaningful that recognition becomes inevitable. And sometimes the most profound family relationships are the ones that can survive the collision between perception and reality, between assumption and truth, between what we think we know and what we are finally brave enough to discover. They cornered me at the charity gala, laughing about my little hobby business, but when Marcus Chin, the Forbes billionaire, walked over and said, "Elena, your empire changed everything for women in finance," their laughter died in their throats. The crystal chandeliers above us seemed to dim as the weight of 20 years of family dismissal hung in the air like expensive perfume mixed with the bitter taste of regret. My siblings had positioned themselves around me in the marble foyer, their designer gowns and tailored tuxedos forming a perfect circle of condescension, their voices carrying that familiar tone they had used since we were children. The one that said I would never measure up to their medical degrees and law partnerships, their country club memberships, and their perfectly curated social media lives that screamed success to anyone who would listen. Before I share what happened next, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are listening from. I love hearing how far this story reaches, because what I am about to tell you changed everything I thought I knew about family, success, and the power of building something beautiful in silence. My brother David, the cardiac surgeon, swirled his champagne glass and let out that laugh he had perfected during his residency, the one that could cut through a patient's hope just as easily as it had cut through my confidence for decades. Sarah, my sister, the corporate attorney, adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet with the precision she used to destroy opposing counsel in depositions, her eyes scanning my simple black dress with the kind of judgment that had taught me to shop in the clearance sections of department stores long after I could afford not to. They had been building to this moment all evening, circling like well-dressed sharks who had caught the scent of what they believed was my latest failure in the water. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was their territory, their chance to shine among the city's elite, to network with potential clients and show off the success that had earned them their place at tables that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. I had been attending for years, quietly writing checks that no one paid attention to, sitting at tables in the back where the lighting was softer and the conversations were quieter, watching my siblings command attention from admirers who hung on every word about their latest medical breakthroughs and legal victories. They never wondered how I could afford the tickets, never questioned the designer purse I carried or the subtle jewelry that adorned my neck and wrists, because in their minds I was still Elena the dreamer, Elena the one who never quite figured it out, Elena who dabbled in little business ventures that never amounted to anything significant. David cleared his throat with the authority he had learned from years of delivering life and death news to anxious families in hospital waiting rooms. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying across the foyer loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "we need to talk about this latest venture of yours." Sarah nodded in agreement, her perfectly styled auburn hair catching the light as she moved closer, her voice joining his with the kind of practiced precision that had made her partners at one of the city's most prestigious law firms. "We are worried about you," she said, though worry was not the emotion I heard in her tone. "We keep hearing about these meetings you have been taking, these phone calls at all hours, and frankly, we think you might be getting involved in something over your head again." The word again hung in the air like an accusation, carrying with it the weight of every time they had watched me fail, every time they had to explain to their friends why their sister could not seem to find her place in the world the way they had. I could feel the other guests beginning to notice our conversation, their champagne glasses pausing halfway to their lips as they sensed the family drama unfolding in real time. A waiter passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, his eyes carefully avoiding our little circle of tension, and I found myself wishing I could disappear into the crowd of successful people who belonged here in a way I had convinced myself I never would. My younger brother Michael, the pediatric oncologist who had been featured on the cover of the local medical journal just last month, stepped forward with the same gentle bedside manner he used with his young patients and their terrified parents. "Elena, we love you," he said, his voice soft but firm, "but this pattern has to stop. You get excited about some new idea, you disappear for months working on it, and then it just fades away like all the others. We do not want to see you hurt yourself financially again, especially now when you are getting older and should be thinking about stability and retirement." The irony of his words was not lost on me, standing there in my $1,000 shoes while he worried about my financial stability, but I had learned long ago that correcting their assumptions only led to more questions I was not ready to answer. I had built my life around their perception of my failures, had created a carefully constructed facade that allowed them to feel superior while protecting the empire I had been building in the shadows of their success. They saw the small apartment I maintained as my official address, the modest car I drove to family gatherings, the simple clothes I wore to their dinner parties, but they never saw the penthouse I actually lived in across town, the collection of luxury vehicles I kept in a private garage, or the investment portfolio that had been quietly growing for 2 decades. Sarah moved closer, her perfume mixing with the scent of money and ambition that permeated every corner of the charity gala, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a caring whisper but sounded more like cross-examination to my ears. "We heard from Mom that you have been meeting with some very wealthy people," she said, her eyes narrowing with the suspicion she had learned to wield in courtrooms across the state. "She is worried you might be getting involved in some kind of scheme, some get-rich-quick thing that is going to leave you broke and embarrassed again. We just want to protect you from making another mistake." Another mistake. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked at their faces, these siblings who had shared my childhood but had never really known me, who had watched me struggle through my 20s and 30s without ever wondering if there might be more to the story than what they could see from their elevated positions in society. They had witnessed my divorce from a husband who had left me for a younger woman with a more traditional definition of success, had seen me move out of the suburban house I had shared with him into what they assumed was a step down in the world, had watched me start and seemingly abandon business venture after business venture without ever asking the right questions about where the money was coming from or where it was going. David took a sip of his champagne and gestured toward the ballroom where the evening's program was about to begin, where tables full of the city's most influential people were waiting to bid on auction items that would raise millions for sick children. "Look around, Elena," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of big brother authority that had followed me through 4 decades of family gatherings. "This is where real success looks like. These people built something that matters, something that lasts. They do not chase every shiny new idea that comes along. They focus, they commit, they build something real." Real. I almost laughed at the word. Standing there surrounded by people who had no idea that the woman they were lecturing about commitment and focus had been managing investment portfolios worth more than their combined annual salaries for the better part of 2 decades. I had learned to smile and nod during these conversations, to let them believe they were teaching me something about success and responsibility, because the alternative would have meant explanations I was not prepared to give and questions I was not ready to answer. Michael reached out and touched my arm with the same gentle pressure he used to comfort the families of his pediatric patients, his voice taking on the tone he had perfected for delivering difficult news with compassion and authority. "We know you are smart, Elena," he said, "and we know you work hard. But sometimes working hard in the wrong direction just leads to more disappointment. Maybe it is time to think about finding something more stable, something more traditional. Sarah has some contacts at nonprofit organizations that might be looking for someone with your people skills." People skills. The phrase would have been amusing if it had not been so patronizing, coming from siblings who had no idea that my people skills had helped me build relationships with some of the most successful investors and entrepreneurs on 3 continents. That my ability to listen and understand had been the foundation of an empire they could not even imagine. I had sat in boardrooms with men and women whose names appeared on the covers of Fortune and Forbes magazines, had negotiated deals that had moved millions of dollars across international markets, had built a reputation in financial circles that opened doors my siblings could never dream of walking through. But they only saw what I allowed them to see, the carefully crafted image of their younger sister who tried hard but never quite succeeded, who had good intentions but lacked the focus and determination that had made them leaders in their respective fields. They had no idea that while they were building their careers in traditional paths that society celebrated and recognized, I had been building something different, something quieter, something that did not require public recognition or family approval to validate its worth. Sarah glanced at her watch, a Cartier that had been a gift from her law firm when she made partner, and I could see her calculating how much longer she needed to endure this conversation before she could move on to more important networking opportunities. "The thing is, Elena," she said, her voice taking on the efficiency she brought to closing arguments, "we are not going to be able to keep bailing you out every time one of these ventures falls apart. We have our own families to think about, our own financial responsibilities. We love you, but we cannot keep enabling this pattern of unrealistic expectations and inevitable disappointment." Bailing me out. The words hit me like ice water, carrying with them the assumption that had colored every family interaction for the past 20 years. The belief that my siblings were somehow responsible for my financial well-being because I could not be trusted to manage my own affairs. They had no idea that the last time I had needed financial help from anyone in my family was more than 2 decades ago, when I was just starting to understand the power of compound interest and strategic investment. They had no memory of the checks I had quietly stopped cashing, the offers of help I had gently declined, the gradual independence I had achieved while maintaining the fiction that they were still my safety net. The conversation was attracting more attention now, other guests beginning to pause in their movement through the foyer to listen to what was clearly becoming a family intervention disguised as a charity gala intermission. I could see the recognition in some of their faces, the way they identified my siblings as the successful Martinez children, the doctor and the lawyer and the pediatric oncologist who had made names for themselves in the community. But none of them recognized me, because I had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible in plain sight, of moving through their world without leaving the kind of impression that would connect me to the empire I had built in silence. David set down his champagne glass on a nearby table with the kind of decisive gesture he used in operating rooms when he had made a life-saving decision, his voice taking on the authority that had made him one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the region. "This has to stop, Elena," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated frustration and disappointment. "We cannot keep watching you chase these impossible dreams while ignoring the reality of your situation. You are 45 years old. You need to start thinking about your future in practical terms, not in terms of some fantasy business that is going to make you rich overnight." Overnight. The word would have been laughable if it had not revealed so much about how completely they misunderstood the journey I had been on. The decades of careful planning and strategic thinking that had gone into building something they could not see because they had never bothered to look beyond their own assumptions. They saw the meetings I took as desperate attempts to find new schemes to chase, not realizing that those meetings were with existing clients whose portfolios I had been managing successfully for years. They interpreted my phone calls at odd hours as signs of instability, not understanding that global markets operate across time zones and successful investing requires attention to opportunities that arise when most people are sleeping. Sarah stepped closer, her legal training evident in the way she positioned herself to make her final argument, her voice taking on the tone she had perfected for convincing juries to see things from her perspective. "Elena, we are saying this because we love you and because someone needs to be honest with you about where this path is leading. You cannot keep living in this fantasy where you are some kind of business mogul while the rest of us deal with real careers and real responsibilities. It is time to grow up and accept that success looks different for different people, and maybe your version of success needs to be more realistic and more sustainable. Fantasy. Business mogul. The phrases echoed in my mind as I looked at their faces. These siblings who thought they were saving me from myself while having no idea that they were standing in the marble foyer of a charity gala where I had quietly donated more money over the years than their combined contributions. Delivered through anonymous channels that protected both my privacy and their perception of their own generosity. They had no knowledge of the scholarship fund I had established at their medical schools, the pro bono legal aid program I had funded at Sarah's law firm, or the research grants I had provided to support Michael's work with pediatric cancer patients. The irony was not lost on me that they were lecturing me about realistic expectations while standing in a room full of people who had achieved exactly the kind of success they insisted was impossible for someone like me to attain. But I had learned that explaining would only lead to more questions, and questions would lead to revelations I was not prepared to make. Not here, not now. Not in a way that would satisfy their need to understand how their perception of reality had been so completely wrong for so many years. Michael moved closer to complete their circle of concern, his voice taking on the gentle firmness he used with parents who were struggling to accept difficult diagnoses about their children's health. "We want to help you, Elena," he said, his eyes sincere with the compassion that had made him one of the most beloved doctors at Children's Hospital. "But you have to be willing to accept help, and that means accepting that maybe your way of doing things has not been working. We can introduce you to people who might be able to offer you more stable opportunities, more traditional paths that could give you the security you deserve." Security. Stability. Traditional paths. The words felt foreign on my ears, concepts that had never appealed to me even when I was young and uncertain about my place in the world. I had always been drawn to the unknown, to the spaces between conventional success and conventional failure where real opportunities existed for people who were willing to think differently and act boldly. While my siblings had followed well-marked paths to predictable destinations, I had been exploring territories they could not even see from their elevated positions in society. But as I stood there surrounded by their concern and their certainty that they knew what was best for me, I felt something shifting in the atmosphere of the gala. A subtle change in the energy of the room that made me aware that our conversation was about to take a turn none of us had anticipated. I could see movement in my peripheral vision, figures approaching our little circle of family drama. And I had the sudden sense that the carefully constructed fiction I had maintained for 20 years was about to collide with a reality none of us were prepared to handle. The chandeliers above us seemed to brighten as footsteps approached across the marble floor, expensive shoes clicking with the confident rhythm of someone who belonged in rooms like this, someone who commanded attention without having to demand it. I could feel my siblings becoming aware of the approaching presence, their conversation beginning to falter as they sensed that our private family intervention was about to become something very different, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about success, about family, and about the sister they had been trying to save from herself for the better part of 4 decades. David was the first to look up, his surgeon's instincts making him aware of changes in his environment that others might miss. And I saw his expression begin to shift as he recognized someone approaching who clearly held significant importance in the social hierarchy of the charity gala. Sarah followed his gaze, her attorney's training making her automatically assess the potential threat or opportunity represented by the newcomer, while Michael maintained his focus on me, still believing that our conversation was the most important thing happening in this moment. But I knew who was coming before I turned to look, knew from the subtle shift in the conversations around us, from the way other guests were beginning to pause and take notice, from the familiar sense of anticipation that always preceded moments when my two worlds were about to collide in ways I could not control or predict. The empire I had built in silence was about to meet the family who had never known it existed. And there was nothing I could do to stop what was about to happen except maintain the dignity and grace that had carried me through every challenge I had faced in my journey from their dismissed little sister to something they could never have imagined.